I think from the earliest of memories, I think my whole life, as I think back and reflect, is all about redemption. Choices I've made that maybe haven't been the best of decisions, but yet God's redemptive grace, mercy, has redeemed me and brought me through. As a child, as I look back with parents that divorced very early on, I can remember back in my childhood being more of a lonely, isolated kid. My dad being a high-powered corporate executive, a really absentee father. Mother left the house when I was 4. I was one of those neighborhood kids that was invited to VBS in summertime, and at the age of 9 I accepted Christ and was saved. Continuing through my childhood and as years progressed, ended up making a lot of poor decisions and acting out. I'll never forget freshman year, I'd already developed some relationships with some other upperclassmen and was invited to a party first weekend in high school, and that pretty much paved my path, and I never looked back. I really got involved into a lot of drugs and alcohol, party scene. Really no respect for any type of authority to speak of, and did everything I could to kind of act out and to rebel against, if you will. And ended up graduating high school. My father and I, we had an argument, and at the time was given a day to pack up everything I owned and move with my grandmother. So that's exactly what I did. She lived in North Dallas area, such a Christ follower and just an epitome and an example of being Christ-like in all our ways, always had, and instructed me to follow Christ, and she always instilled God in me and always pressed me and pushed me really hard. And knowing I needed that in my heart, still I wasn't ready to surrender and give my life. So I continued on, met a lot of friends in the Dallas area that developed relationships with, and that they were of no good, and continued to make poor decisions. Heavy drug use now, continue to get in trouble. So even though I'm making these decisions and living my life this way, I'm still going to school. I'm a full-time college student while maintaining a part-time job, making excellent grades, and that continued on for a couple of years. And one of my lifelong goals, I come from a family of Aggies, and my goal was to get into A&M, which I earned the grades and I was accepted into A&M. And it was one of those things I always had the commitment to God that, hey, if I can get into A&M, then I will turn from my ways and my partying, and I will completely surrender and turn my life over to you. My prayer was answered and granted, and that I was accepted to A&M. I go down there with complete intent to start living my life for Christ and for God, and yet get down there and once again hook up with the wrong people, and within a matter of months to a year, I completely failed and had lost everything at that point. The decision was made. My grandmother had said, "You're moving back to Dallas." And at that point, moved back, and it's like, hey, all these ideas and beliefs, and that, hey, I've always been a failure. People have always looked at me like that. My goal that I had accomplished, hey, I've essentially failed at. I amount to nothing. And so at this point, my life really took a turn for the absolute worst, in that I had no point in wanting to even live. I do remember a time that I'd been partying for days, now living back in Dallas, as I mentioned, and I'd gotten to a point that I thought, you know, I'm going to get in my car, I'm going to drive as far east as I can, and I'm going to go sit on the top of a mountain and basically freeze to death. I had shared my plan with my sister one night, and I told her exactly what I planned to do the following morning. And she had tried to discourage me, talk me out of it, but nonetheless, I was still going to follow through, and went out to start my car that next morning, and my car wouldn't start. And so I resort to going back in, and then this turns into I'm staying with her for a period of days. So now we're talking the fall of 2003, and my grandmother, who's steadfastly been praying for me, has many of her church members and friends at her church in North Dallas praying for me, all decide to do an intervention. And so at this point, I end up going to a in-house recovery center. End up going down there for, I was in there for 11 months. And this was faith-based and all about Christ and God, and so very sound on biblical principles, reading scripture, daily devotionals. Was really good for me, but there again, you only get out so much of what you put in. And so I was half committed. I'm there for 11 months. I get out, go back to Dallas, and fall right back into my own ways in a matter of time. I'd gotten into a situation that I'd been on a binge and been doing dope for several days and really out of my head. And basically I'd gotten into somebody's house one night under the impression that people from my past were after me, this and that. And either way, ended up getting in their house, middle of the night. They call the police. And the police come and pick me up. With it not being any criminal activity, so to speak, I was taken into a mental institution for evaluation for 2 to 3 days. And so went in and completely out of my head. It literally took me 2 or 3 days to come to. And I'll never forget in that I was being released one morning, and I was walking out, being escorted out by this young nurse. We got outside, young ladies escorting me out, and I just remember breaking down, and I was just so emotional. And she looked at me and she asked me, she says, "I just have to ask, why are you crying?" And I just explained to her that I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have anybody to turn to. I didn't have anywhere to go. I had basically lost everything, and it really just put it into perspective to me. So that hit very, very close, and that there again, this was a time that I had nobody. I lived out of my car in a couple of situations for a couple of days when I couldn't find anybody that I could, crash at. But this was one of those that, hey, I mean, I didn't have my car at this point. I basically had the clothes on my back. Being estranged from my mom at this point for 7, 8 years, I went and I stayed under the bridge at 635 75 there at the High 5 interchange for a couple of days. And then at one point I just felt led, and I broke down, and I ended up calling my mom, who I hadn't had any communication with in 7 or 8 years at this point. I called my mom, my stepdad, who I've always been really fond of. We've had a very special relationship, unique bond. He came and picked me up. He owns a construction company, so I start working with him. I start getting back on my feet. I can vividly remember this too, and working with him was sharing stories, and I laughed, and there was a genuine laugh, and I could really feel joy. And looking back, I have no doubt and know wholeheartedly that was Christ resurfacing, that I was getting my life straight, clean of drugs and all the baggage that is associated with. I could really feel Christ starting to shine through and become present in my heart again. And so anyway, I continue on that track for a period of time, and then things take a turn for the worse with my mom relationally, and she and I ended up leaving there and resorted back to the drugs again. Full speed ahead, drugs, selling once again, and get involved in that whole scene. People often ask about rock bottom. I don't know that there was ever a rock bottom, but I do vividly remember that there were times that God pulled on my heart, and I can't look and reflect back on anything but it being the Spirit of God and changing and conforming. And there was an instance in January of 2006 in which I broke down. And there again, by nature, I'm really not an emotional person. Broke down and just remember having a thought that I don't have really anything in my life. And at this point, I'm 25 years old, and every goal, every ambition, every desire that I had ever had, I allowed Satan to steal and rob me of. And I just remember having that thought, and while I was so sad and remorseful, I was angry. And I was angry that I knew that I was capable of so much more with Christ, and that He had called me to do so much more, and yet I had failed Him. But at that point, I wanted to make a commitment, and I did. And that's a turning point that I said, you know what? From this day forward, I'll live my life for Christ in every way that I can. And so 8 months later, I went back and I was awarded an opportunity, thanks to first and foremost God, but yet secondly my grandmother, and to continue in my education. And I went back and I earned my degree 2.5 years later, graduated from school, and during that time, met the love of my life, and ended up graduating a short time thereafter, ended up marrying Stephanie and being so tremendously blessed and in my opinion, the best woman on earth. God just started restoring blessing after blessing in my life. And looking at that, I can't help but relate where Paul talks about that in Philippians 4 and talking about that he's had and experienced everything and then yet lost it all. The underlying foundation of it all is a relationship with Christ. And that's where the meaning and the substance and it's all at, if you will. Without Christ, it's all for naught anyway. Everyone is worthy of redemption, no matter what you've done or who you are. And I think it all starts with the understanding that it's all about God. I mean, specifically what we allow God to do through and in us. If we're willing to give ourselves to God, that's all He's asking for, is for us to die to self every day and commit our lives and live for Him. And with that, you can't go wrong. So there's been a time in my life where I had absolutely no relationship with my parents, and now I've got a fully restored relationship. There was a time I was addicted to drugs, and now by the grace of God, I've been clean for over 16 years. There was a time that I've been so sick in my life that I didn't even want to live. And now I wake up every day excited for each and every day and for what God has for me. There's been several instances in where I've lived out of my car and even under a bridge, and now I'm so very, very blessed to have a home. There's a time in my life that I never pictured myself even getting married, and now I've got a wonderful wife and a beautiful daughter. And there is absolutely no other reason that I'm alive and here today other than by the grace, mercy, and ultimate redemption of God and Jesus Christ in my life.